I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Annette Simmons.
I began to discover that, it's the story that everybody's telling themselves that determines their behavior in a group. And so what I learned in how storytelling is a part that nobody else was paying attention to. And I thought it should be a much bigger part of a manager's job, of a leader's job.
Annette Simmons is founder of Group Process Consulting, whose clients include NASA, the IRS, and Microsoft. She has been featured on CNBC's Power Lunch and NPR's Market Watch, and has been quoted in Fortune, The Washington Post, and other publications. She's the author of several books, including The Story Factor and Whoever Tells the Best Story Wins. Before we get started, I just want to say that support for On Brand and all shows on the Marketing Podcast Network is provided by ActiveCampaign. If you're looking for a way to grow your business, you need to check out ActiveCampaign. It is a powerful marketing automation platform that can help you increase your sales, improve your customer service, and build stronger relationships with your customers. With ActiveCampaign, you can create and send email campaigns, manage your leads and customers, create landing pages, set up automated workflows, and track your results, all in one approachable platform. ActiveCampaign has over 10,000 five-star reviews on G2 from happy customers. Preview Me is one. They're a B2B software company that uses ActiveCampaign to send their prospective customers highly visual and personalized emails as they progress through CRM stages, such as completing a demo. This has increased their click-through rate 96%. If you are serious about growing your business, you need to check out ActiveCampaign. Try it today for free and see how it can help you achieve your goals. For a limited time, ActiveCampaign is offering listeners of the On Brand podcast a chance to double your contacts for free when you sign up at activecampaign.com/activate. That means if your email list has 10,000 contacts, you only need to pay for 5,000. Or you can pay for the 10,000 and get an extra 10,000 totally free. Personalize your customer experience, but do it with automation, just like 185,000 businesses have at ActiveCampaign. Go to activecampaign.com/activate to sign up today. That's activecampaign.com/activate. Terms and conditions apply.
So you couldn't make Creator Economy Expo this year? No worries. You can get all the amazing content from CEX 2023 online with a digital pass. And Marketing Podcast Network listeners, that's you get $100 off the price. This pass includes on-demand access to 13 amazing keynote presentations, including Jesse Cole from the Savannah Bananas on how to create a fan's first business. You also get 32 in-depth how-to breakout presentations in 8 incredible tracks, including podcasting, Web 3.0, revenue growth, subscriber generation, SEO and conversion, and social video. That's well over 40 hours of programming to help you grow and build your content business from the comfort of your own computer or phone. And you have access for the rest of 2023 to learn at your own pace. Go to bit.ly/CEX on demand. The URL is bit.ly/CEX on demand. All lowercase, all one word. And use the code MPN100 for $100 off, bringing your one-time price to just $495. All the learning from CEX on demand for the rest of the year. Get it for a limited time at bit.ly/CEX on demand.
Annette Simmons, welcome to On Brand.
Pleasure to be here.
I mentioned in our little pre-show chat that I feel like you've been in my ear because I've been listening to the audiobook. And through your own stories, I discovered a commonality in background of you working in advertising. And that was a path that I was on for a number of years as well. What is it about advertising that makes people end up in the business of story?
Well, I think advertising is the business of story. But when I first wanted to go to, I wanted to study psychology in college, and my dad was like, "No, that's a waste of time. You have to get a business degree." And marketing was actually the closest to psychology that I could get, because that's what it is. Marketing
Yeah.
is psychology, and unlike the other kind of psychology, if you're not good at it, you don't last. And so the advertising agency, and I was there in the 80s, the heyday of advertising agencies, working with J. Walter Thompson, and I would walk past, somebody's office. I remember this guy was sitting cross-legged on top of his desk with his tie across his forehead like a bandana, um, pretending to meditate. And it's just like, this is where I want to be. These are my people. So I think advertising is attractive for several reasons. One is if you like to entertain, if you want to influence people, but it's also just a great. It used to be. It's not so much anymore. Quantitative business analysis has prevented a whole lot of people from the chance to be creative. But yeah, I think that's it.
Well, it's interesting. Your dad sounds like a smart guy. See, we ended up the same place, but I'm like the strange mirror image of that, because I was in theater arts and was encouraged by my parents to have some sort of a backup. So I went with psychology,
Ah,
and then ended up working in marketing for, I think, that very reason that you just said, if you like to entertain and influence. And boy, it's a much more almost alliterative, at least sounding way of saying that, if theater arts and psychology. So it's like, if you weren't to have a marketing degree, I always said I feel like this is a good combo
yeah.
otherwise, because it's about entertaining and influencing. And I think if you're on that path, you end up kind of finding that path of story and going deeper into it. So what did that journey look like for you?
Well, I actually started studying psychology informally when I was 14 years old. And so I learned transactional analysis. My dad was a social worker. And so he would give me books to study. And so we did transactional analysis. And that was really the first pop psychology. And if you look at transactional analysis, you have different ego states where you can talk like you're a parent with your finger wagging. You can talk like an adult, which is the sane part of you, or a child, which can be screw you or let's go play. And so in a way, that form of pop psychology is storytelling, because you have three different characters inside you, and then when you interact with other people, there are certain patterns. And so the patterns they called games people play. And so, so that was embedded in my framework for understanding myself and the world very early on. And so I always have been looking for patterns and, kind of what character are you playing here? And I just use that in the marketing world when you have personas of a customer and customer journeys and all that sort of stuff. But then advertising felt empty to me after a while. It's like I was working on the Ford business and getting people to buy cars they didn't actually really need, was not satisfying to me. What was satisfying was trying to get the team that I was working on to work together. And so the group psychology part became more important to me. So I decided to go back to grad school. I left advertising, went back to grad school, and got a combination degree in adult education and psychology. It was actually a training development degree, but it was early days, so I got to choose the courses I wanted. It wasn't like a hard curriculum yet. And so I did all the psychology that, I couldn't do before, but I also specialized in social psych. So understanding how groups work together brought me to the idea of the group needs to share the same story about what trust means here, about what our goal is. And so then I began consulting. I wrote a book on Territorial Games. Turf wars drove me nuts. And if you've been in an advertising agency, that fighting for budget can be a lethal, pastime. When I began to discover that it's the story that everybody's telling themselves that determines their behavior in a group, I began to study storytelling in a different way from a folklore point of view. And so went to the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee in 94, and realized that adult education is very much a function of storytelling. Training and development is, getting people to do tasks, but adult education traditionally has been like liberation theology, social movements, that sort of stuff. And so what I learned in how storytelling in particularly union, organizing, is a part that nobody else was paying attention to. And I thought it should be a much bigger part of a manager's job, of a leader's job, should be a much bigger part of the meetings that we have. And so I began to use storytelling to influence the groups that I would facilitate to be more honest with each other. I wrote a book called A Safe Place for Dangerous Truth. And to dive into those things that were particularly divisive so that we could familiarize ourselves with both sides and realize that we're all on the same team. When I had success with that, one of my friends was like, "Girl, you need to write a book." and because I realized I was talking storytelling all the time. I had designed a workshop for federal employees, executives, and that's when I wrote The Story Factor, the first edition.
I want to talk a bit about the story factor because it's certainly, like I mentioned, top of mind with me, and I want to come up with the diplomatic way of saying this. You talk about the power of story, and I feel like you see this kind of in the zeitgeist around us. I always make the joke when I'm speaking at a conference about storytelling. It's easy to, find a magazine article about the power of storytelling, to go to a conference and see someone there talking about the power of storytelling. And I usually say, I guess that's me for this event. But there's a lot of material out there about storytelling, and it's an easy thing to kind of get that initial nod of the head. But as it gets put into practice, it's a much bigger topic, and it's almost like that thing. Once you start unspooling it can get hard for people to follow. And I bring this back to the story factor because I honestly think, having read several books about story and storytelling and application in the world of work, that there's not a better book out there. So,
Oh, thank you.
talk a bit about how you. I love your friend that said you have to write a book. Hey, easier said than done, especially on a topic of stories. So, where did you start in organizing what would become the story factor?
Well, the first time I wrote about storytelling was actually a chapter in my book, A Safe Place for Dangerous Truth. So I started using storytelling as a facilitator. And then I realized that because I would go to all the storytelling workshops with the folklorist group. And if you remember, in 1998, it was not, swing a dead cat, and hit a storyteller.
Right. That's
It
true.
was-
That's true.
It was, so I had the freedom to put it together the way it came to me. And so the arrangement was a function of me as a behavioral scientist, me as a group process facilitator. And so when I talk about story, it's not necessarily in a competitive narrative. And a lot of the stuff that's been written about story in the last 20 years is a function of storytelling as a competitive advantage. Now, what's embedded in that is the idea that this person is running a competitive narrative. I was not running a competitive narrative. I was running a collaborative narrative because, of course, my first job was get groups to, come together and have this big come to Jesus meeting and resolve big problems with one conversation. I then itemized kind of all the different ways that I use storytelling and came up with the 6 kinds of stories. And the 6 kinds of stories, if you look at what I came up with, you can, and my background, you can see the function of these stories in terms of group process. People want to know who you are. They want to know why you're here. Sometimes you need to teach them something and you can do a better job of it than you've been doing. Sometimes you need to share a vision. Sometimes you need to preempt when you already know that they're going to go to the bad place. You have to tell a story that kind of acknowledges, yes, that's how you might feel initially, and that's the I know what you're thinking story. So the fundamentals came from my experience as a group process facilitator, and my basis as in terms of running a collaborative narrative as often as a competitive narrative. Now, what I see in some of the things that have been written these days is that it comes from this idea of having a competitive advantage, and I'm not interested.
Yeah.
I'm when you tell your who I am and why I'm here story, it's who you are, how you show up in the world, why you're here, is not a function of how you can climb over somebody else or how you can own a market and keep other people out. So I come from a different place.
On Brand will be right back after this.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Christopher Hines hosts a great podcast called Founder Success Methods. Chris, tell us what these fine folks will get out of listening.
You'll learn how to really grow your startup and get the basic strategies to build a successful company. We show you all the details and all the strategies that you just can't find on Google, YouTube, or even other podcasts.
Ooh, we're going to be lined up for this one. Where can people subscribe?
You can search for the podcast Founder Success Methods wherever you listen to podcasts, or find me on Twitter at Chris Podcasting.
Or go to marketingpodcasts.net. You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Carrie Barrett hosts a great podcast called The VIQ Project. Carrie, tell us what these fine folks will get out of listening.
Okay, you know how you go to shoot a 2-minute video, except it takes 2 hours, you hate yourself on camera, you don't know what to do with it, and so it doesn't perform? You'll get all the tips and tricks you need to fix all of that on this podcast.
Wow, we're going to be lining up for this. Where can people subscribe?
You can find it on my website, which is carriebarrett.com. You can also find it if you search the VIQ Project podcast on YouTube. Of course, you can find the show at marketingpodcasts.net, or you can subscribe and search for the VIQ Project podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Now, back to the show. Would you say more about how your work kind of stacks? Because you have the story factor and you also have whoever tells the best story wins. What's the I almost said story too many times in that sentence, which I'm sure is a challenge you've run into before. But I was going to say, what's the story,
Right.
or what's the progression of your two books on story and how they stack together?
Well, your first question, which is how I organized it, and when I sat down to write a book about storytelling, it's like writing about religion. As a matter of fact, religion is a subset of storytelling. So it's like the biggest subject ever. If you, so that was the story factor. That was my goal, is to at least touch on all the different aspects of storytelling that I had used and that were successful and that I had seen others become successful using. So, I had taught that course in 98. By the time I wrote the book, I had taught that course for 2 years. I'm a practitioner, so I didn't come up with anything that I hadn't tested out with people and watched it work. The stuff that didn't work didn't go in the book. And one of the things that worked really well and kept working was the 6 stories. And because people coming to storytelling, it's so easy to talk about storytelling and so easy to come up with, definitions of what it is, but those aren't useful definitions. For instance, my definition of a story is designed to be a practitioner's definition. This is, something that somebody, it informs how you approach storytelling. So I believe a story is a significant emotional experience that's narrated in a way that feels real to the teller and the listener. And so that's kind of a how-to definition, as opposed to some definitions that are accurate, like a story has a beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily informative. The whoever tells the best story wins is basically the workshop I ended up teaching, 7 years into after the Story Factor was published. Those were the 4 buckets, which is a time you shined, a time you blew it, a mentor, or a book or a movie where you pull a scene, and then it fits into each one of the 6 kinds of story. You can find 4 different kinds of story for that one. It was a matrix that just worked, and so I knew that you can talk about story, but if you're not telling stories, then you're not. One of the things that I know is if I tell you a story, you're going to tell me a story back. So we talk about advertising. So I imagine, we talk about the guy with his tie wrapped around his forehead. I imagine you've got some stories that not necessarily going to go on the podcast because there were crazy times. But if we were sharing stories, the stories would just start to flow. And so the second book, well, the first book I read has 110 stories in it, Story Factor. But the second book has examples of all 6 kinds of stories from 4 different, sources, because I think that reading stories is what prompts you to think of your own stories.
Well, and I love the of those prompts. I love asking people about their mentors but I love that you throw in the book, the movie example, because sometimes people lock up thinking about, oh, I got to think of the best moment, but there's something that it seems freeing about looking for an example from a movie. I mean, you talk about that in
and
the
again,
book too.
That's the function of my experience, because when I was teaching storytelling, I used to use this clip from the movie. Is it Amistad, the slave ship? Is that?
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
I get mixed up. So there's this scene in the movie where John Adams, they've been begging him to join the fight to free these enslaved Africans who took control of the ship instead of convicting them of mutiny. And Morgan Freeman character comes in, and John Adams says, well, I'll give you a piece of advice free in unlawyerly like fashion. It's whoever tells the best story wins. And you can tell he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. And so he calls him back and he says, what's your story? And he says, well, I'm from Alabama. He goes, no, you're somebody who was born into slavery, who bought his way out of it and has dedicated his life. Anyway, so that I use that clip. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, let's mark that down. You can use a movie clip.
Yeah, and you've got some great ones in there too that, when you find what speaks to people, like I love the example of the scene in Saving Private Ryan where he reveals that he's a teacher, and they've all been, wondering what he does back home. But boy, you talk about it makes me think of you coming into storytelling and talking about the group dynamics. I mean, that's great illustration of
Exactly.
the power of
So
story.
half of the stories I was telling was kind of trying to train people how to de-escalate.
Yeah.
And so, it's the chicken and the egg, which comes first. You just dive in there at some point, and sometimes I can get a story from my audience. And that's just as good. Actually, sometimes it's better because then I'm sharing credibility with my audience, and where everybody's more engaged when you do that.
So we've talked about stories and groups. What about stories and leaders? How is story an important tool for leaders to master?
Well, you can be a good leader or a bad leader. And my definition of a good leader is an ethical leader. But unethical leaders like Putin can use storytelling as well. And we see the results of his storytelling causing violence and death. When ethical leaders use storytelling, there there are different purposes. One is to share power. And so sharing power is behaviorally a different task than creating obedience situations. And so storytelling is much more important if you're the kind of leader who wants to share power and have participative decision making, because everybody needs to understand what everybody else does. If you have one guy at the top and he's dictating a story that nobody's allowed to question, that's one thing. But I'm more interested in the organic revelation of the goodness of people that comes when we share our stories. What's meaningful to you? What was meaningful to you yesterday? Like your question you ask about, what's a brand that made you smile? If we're looking for positive deviance there. And so it's a different approach to storytelling. It has a lot more curiosity, I think.
I love that. And you set me up perfectly for the segue to ask you, Annette, for the brand that has made you smile recently.
Well, I'm a keen gardener. Well, I'm not a keen gardener. That might create pictures in people's minds that I don't deserve, but I love gardening. And there's a nursery that's north of town, and they are just magic. The grounds is fun to walk around, just like you'd go walk around a park. The people there are so attentive. They understand plants. They have plenty of time to help you. because the place is so big, they'll actually, if you're looking at a plant, they'll put it in the back, well, on a desk for you, write you a ticket, and you can just keep on going without having to cart around, all your plants. And I just love that place. So it makes me smile. And of course, the plants are just 2 steps above what you can get elsewhere. I still go to Home Depot, for my impatience, but if I want the good stuff, I go there.
Exactly. Yeah. Everybody. I've got the same. You've got 2 nurseries. You've got the one you go to for the good stuff, and then you've got the one for the basic run for the mulch and such. So
Right.
Annette, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Well, I have a website still, and it's got lots of information for free, AnnetteSimmons.com. And if they want to email me, I answer my emails. I'm always happy to talk story. And I'm at AnnetteSimmons.com.
Awesome. Well, we will link up to all of that in our show notes, which folks can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Annette Simmons, thanks for being on brand with us.
What a pleasure. Thank you.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.